And there we go. All right. So Bob, welcome. And I imagine we'll have other people join soon. And our topic this week is more reading of Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg's take on this week's Torah reading, which is Parashat Yitro, or the section named after Jethro. Jethro, famous for being Moses's father-in-law. And we're going to talk about some of the question of preeminence and honor and all of these sorts of things. Viva Gottlieb Zornberg has some very interesting insights. Normally, if we were sort of going for the highlights of this week's Torah reading, we'd be headed directly for the Ten Commandments and the revelation at Sinai. But instead, we're going to look at this interaction between Moses and Jethro at the start, a whole chapter, chapter 19 of Exodus, which we'll look at briefly. And then we'll look at Professor Gottlieb Zornberg's reflections on it. So that's our preview for this evening. If you are tuning in via Facebook, we are thrilled that you are here. And I look forward to maybe being able to switch over to Facebook and see if you have any questions. I put the link on the Facebook link, so if you want to join us live on Zoom as opposed to on Facebook, you're welcome to do so. All right. So that takes us to 8 o'clock, which is time for our blessing. Our blessing is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Asher Kiddushanu V'Tzivanu La'asot B'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with commandments, and you command us to participate in the give and take, the back and forth of learning. And we have Adina joining us and Mark Goldman. Wonderful. So come on in, everybody. Nice to see you, Adina. Adina, I'm sorry I didn't get back to you on your phone message.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
All right. So, and let's see if Mark can get in. All right, we're going to start by looking at this week's Torah reading in Hebrew and English, which is, as I said before, Parashat Yitro. And we are looking at the Hebrew and English from one of my favorite books, the Commentator's Bible, edited and translated by a wonderful scholar named Professor Michael Karasik. This week's Torah reading starts out very simply with the words Vayishma Yitro Choen Midyan Choten Moshe et Kol Asher Asa Elohim LeMoshe uLYisrael Amo Ki Hotzi Adonai Et. So this Hebrew ends abruptly here, but the English is, roughly speaking, and Yitro, which is Jethro, right? That's the name there, transliterated from the Hebrew, but it's really Yitro, so you can see it up here. Is how it's pronounced. Yitro, who was the priest of Midian, who was the father-in-law of Moses, heard all which God did for Moses and for Israel, Moses's people, his people, or for God's people, right? His people could be this. When God brought, next page, here comes Phil, Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, when God brought them out of Egypt. So this is a story that, unlike a lot of our other stories, first of all, it's named for somebody who is not one of our main characters, not one of our protagonists, Yitro, who is this minor character, as it were, the father-in-law of Moses. And so it starts out with his hearing. Hearing is going to be a big thing here. Hearing all that God had done for Moses and God's people, how God had brought Israel out from Egypt. Okay, so what happens next? Well, reunion time. Turns out Moses hasn't been with his family at this point. So we see, Adina, did you have a question? Okay.
No.
All right. Anybody feel free to interrupt me with questions, of course.
I have a view. Are we here?
We are here. You're here. Nice to see you, Mark. So, all right, we are continuing. So verse 2 here, starting here in the Hebrew, Vayikach Yitro Choten Moshe et Tzipora Eshet Moshe achar shluchecha. So, and Jethro, Yitro, the father-in-law of Moses, took Zipporah, the wife of Moses, after she had been sent. So this is clearly at some point or another, Moses said, this is too dangerous a game for me to bring my family along on. Going and making demands of the Egyptian Pharaoh is too hazardous. It's not a family outing. And so he had sent Zipporah home to her father. And now her father, Moses' father-in-law, Yitro, is bringing her back. And not just her, their two sons. So ve'et shnei vaneha asher sham shem ha'echad Gershom ki amar ger hayiti be'eretz nochria. So the first son, one of whom was named, so her two sons, the name of the first was Gershom, which is a combination of the words ger and sham, because Moses said, a stranger was I in a foreign land. So I was a stranger there. So Moses named his first son Gershom. And in verse 4 it says, V'shem ha'echad Eliezer, ki Elohei avi be'ezri vayatzileni mecherev Pharaoh. And the name of the other one is Eliezer, because God, my father, the God of my father, was my help and was my deliverance from the sword of Pharaoh. So, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So we've got these two sons. We've got Zipporah. They're coming back with Yitro. And what happens? And of course, we've got this sidebar. This sidebar about their names is kind of in Moses's voice from the past. And we haven't heard about these sons yet, but it's totally like, we're just getting a little bit here as it goes through. Welcome. We had somebody else join us, which is great. So welcome, Yael. And then verse 5, we get back into the story. Vayavo Yitro, chotem Moshe uvaneha. And Jethro, Yitro came. Yitro, the father-in-law of Moses, came uvanav, and his sons, Ve'ishto, and with his wife, El Moshe, to Moses, El Hamidbar Asher Hu Choneh Sham Har HaElohim, into the wilderness, which is here, in which Moses camped there at the mountain of God. So this is Jethro's bringing everybody, Moses' immediate family, to him. It's interesting, of course, where is Jethro coming from? Yes, Yael, Midian, you are correct. I read your lips there. You are
Midian.
Yes, absolutely. And Midian is identified as the desert or the wilderness as well. And so one of the things we're going to look at in Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg's reflections on this is the difference between the desert that Yitro, that Jethro comes from, and the desert in which the Israelites are. Is there some difference between these wildernesses? So that's going to be one of our questions as we go forward. So what happened when he arrived, when Jethro arrived, when Yitro arrived? Vayomer el Moshe ani chotencha Yitro ba elecha ve'eshtecha u'shnei vaneha. So he said to Moses, now this is interesting, it's translated up here, he sent word to Moses, because of course, that's what it looks like in the story. But it really only says he said to Moses, I am your father-in-law, Yitro, coming to you with your wife and and her two sons with her. So this is interesting. Obviously, Jethro would be known to Moses with the wives. So this is why the translator here says he sent word, not just and he said, because clearly we can imagine Jethro showing up at the outside of the camp, and it's a big camp, it's hundreds of thousands of people, and Moses isn't there greeting everybody. And this is borne out by the next verse explaining it. This is what we have to do when we translate from the Hebrew. Sometimes we have few words and we have to figure out what they're implying, even when the explicit meaning is clear. Getting the image in our mind from what the storyteller is trying to tell us is not so easy. So here in verse 7, it says, Vayetze Moshe likrat chotno, and Moses went out, literally went out from where he was to call to his father-in-law, vayishtachu, and he bowed low, vayishak lo, and he kissed him, vayish alo ish larehu, and they each of them asked after their friend, lishalom, after their peace, their wholeness, their welfare. They greeted each other warmly. Vayavohu ha'ohala, and they went into the tent. Now, by the way, if we were reading this from a different perspective today, the big question is, so Moses went out and greeted his father-in-law, but his wife and kids were with them. And it doesn't say anything about that, which seems strange, right? It seems like there's a missing part of this story. So here, what is even more interesting is what happens, the first thing that happens here. Oh, by the way, Rashi here has a comment on the thing that I brought up earlier. Rashi says he sent word to Moses, literally, and he said unto Moses, but NJPS, that he sent word, has the sense correctly. I, your father-in-law, am coming to you with your wife and her two sons. If you will not come out to meet us on my account, come out on your wife's. If not on her account, on that of her two sons. So this is very interesting. Rashi reads into each of these words that the word order here is Jethro is outside the camp and is basically demanding to be seen. And in his demand, he says, come to meet me, but if not me, meet your wife. And if not on account of her, meet your sons. And then obviously Moses honors him. And then what happens when they get back into the tent is interesting. ויספר משה לחותנו את כל אשר עשה אדוני לפרעה ולמצרים על אודות ישראל את ההתלאה אשר מצאת בדרך ויצלם אדוני. So Moses told to his father-in-law all which God did to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians on account on the account of Israel, for the sake of Israel, and all of the difficulties, the hardships which they had found on the way, and how God had delivered them. Vayached Yitro al kol hatova asher asa Adonai leYisrael, and Yitro rejoiced about all of the good which God did for Israel. We're going to talk a lot about, if we get to it, this word rejoiced here. It's a very interesting connotation here. It's not normal, and you can see this comment from Rashi is going to come back to us. The straightforward meaning of the unusual word vayichad is as translated, meaning rejoiced, but the Midrash takes it to imply that his flesh turned to goosebumps with horror at the destructions of the Egyptians. That is why people say, don't slur an Aramean in front of even a 10th generation convert, because people still feel some connection to the people they come from. Oh, we have some chats, sorry. Yes, Phil, it says her two sons. Aren't they Moses' sons? If so, why is it not acknowledged? It is a good question. I think, so we can retroject a little bit. Moses has been away for a while, and emphasizing that they're Moses' sons takes Zipporah and Yitro out of the equation. And Jethro is making the argument that his daughter and he are important, providing, even by only saying, we are related to your sons. So he's emphasizing the relationship to his daughter and to him, perhaps as a way of making sure that Moses takes note of them, understanding that Moses is going to be attached to his sons no matter what. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. So Jethro rejoices and then does something amazing. Talks about the redeeming the Israelites from the hand of the Egyptians, and then he says, then it continues here in verse 10. And we welcome Steve. Thank you for coming. Vayomer Yitro Baruch Adonai Asher Hitzil Etchem. And Jethro says, praised, blessed is God who redeemed you, who saved you, Miyad Mitzrayim, from the hands of the Egyptians, Umiyad Paro, and from the hand of Pharaoh, Asher Hitzil et ha'am mitachat yad Mitzrayim, who saved this people from under the Egyptians. Ata yadati ki gadol Adonai mikol ha'elohim. Now I know that greater is God of all the gods. He v'davar asher zadu alehem, because of all of these things that God has done. Vayikach Yitro choten Moshe, and Yitro, the father-in-law of Moses, took an olah uzvachim, a burnt offering and sacrifices, lelohim, made this burnt offering right here to God. Vayavo Aharon v'chol zichnei Yisrael, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel, le'echol lechem im choten Moshe lifnei Elohim, to eat bread with the father-in-law of Moses before God. So that leads to this idea that Jethro has an immediate conversion. He becomes Jewish on the spot. And he does so, and I'd like to contrast this a little bit with, remember last week we spoke about the reluctance of the Israelites. The Israelites are a skeptical, pain in the butt people, right? We know this about them. We talked at length about their God attempting to convince them of things. But here, without witnessing, without seeing anything, Jethro converts upon hearing. And this may be something about the power of a story versus the power of being in the middle of the story. That sometimes when we are caught up in events, we don't see their significance. But when we can tell the story, we may get a better picture of it. In other words, it almost feels like Jethro has a more powerful sense of God and redemption than the Israelites did. And it's a very interesting piece to think on, especially as we look. We're going to move over to Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg on this right now. So this is the Particulars of Rapture. This is the cover page, Reflections on Exodus by Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. And having given us a little sense of this text, she's going to take us deep into this. Because, again, here is one of the things I'd like us to keep in the back of our mind. When this entire section of the Torah, this is the weekly reading on which we read, during which we read about the encounter of the Israelites with God at Sinai. It is the giving of the Ten Commandments. It is the full-on revelation and everything. But it doesn't start there. It starts with Jethro.
Can I ask you a question?
Please, by all means.
So, and I just caught it as you were changing screens there. I've always wondered about this. So it's when you read it the one way, it's as if God is saying that there are other gods.
Uh-huh.
God's saying there's no other gods but me. He said, I'm the God that you got to listen to. Forget about those other gods. I'm just wondering, what's the interpretation of that? Because he's not saying all the other gods are false gods. It's like, I'm the one you should listen to. Forget about that.
So Steve, this is a very good point. The nature of biblical theology is not strictly monotheistic. God is constantly comparing God's self to other gods. Moses talks about God showing God to be greater than the other gods. We sing in our daily prayer service, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like you among the gods, O God. Right? That's in our prayer service, which is from the Song of the Sea, from the Torah. So one of the things that we see is that we can look at the 5 books of Moses in particular, this early rendition of Jewish theology, as an argument for God being greater than all the other gods. Not that they're false gods, but they're small gods. And that this moves into a more formal universal monotheism in the next iteration of our theologies in the books of prophets. That it turns out the theology of the Jewish people is an evolving idea. And God is an evolving idea. And in the 5 books of Moses, God is much more of a character than an idea. God plays a role in this, the role of a parent, the role of an authority figure, the role of somebody struggling with difficult people, the role of a deity who truly doesn't understand what's wrong with humanity. Right? God creates humans in God's image, and they seem to not get God at all. From the Garden of Eden to the generation of Noah to the Israelites rejecting God and Moses and then grumbling, the whole deal. God is this frustrated figure, this jealous, angry, upset parental figure. And it takes our consciousness of the divine as the bearers of biblical civilization a while to develop the idea that you're talking about, that there is only one God. And that God is everybody's God, and we have a special relationship with that God. That comes out much later in prophets. So for example, while at the High Holy Days, we read about God who seems to care about the relationship between Abraham and Isaac, right? This personal God. We also read the book of Jonah. And the book of Jonah talks about God caring about the residents of Nineveh. In fact, it is Jonah who is more provincial, less willing to admit to a universal God. And it is God who says, Jonah, you don't understand. These are my people too. I created them too. I care about them too. Does that help, Steve?
A little bit, but my thought was that, after all, how long were the Jews in Egypt? 300 some odd years or something like that? And the Egyptians had like hundreds of gods and all the ancient civilizations. So I would just think that old habits die hard. And it would make sense to me, like, forget all those other gods. Like, he's asking them overnight to change 300 years of the history they've lived with.
Absolutely.
And
So
I would think that sense would be
I like that idea, Steve. What you're talking about there makes a lot of sense, because you're saying that God and Moses are talking the language of the Israelites who are still in sort of a polytheistic system. And what we see here, which sort of actually supports your piece, is that Jethro himself serves as this symbol of somebody being persuaded to understand monotheism after being a polytheistic priest.
Yeah, it just always perplexing to me that overnight you're supposed to be going cold turkey, forget everything that you generations have experienced, and then do it this way. And I think anybody that's trying to break an old habit, that's a really hard thing to do.
Well, Absolutely. I mean, and again, it makes an interesting point for putting Jethro here. Because Jethro is not just somebody who lived under the Egyptians. Jethro is a priest of a foreign god. And Jethro does have an overnight conversion. And Jethro doesn't have any of the special effects, the miracles to support it. So in many cases, what we can look at Jethro's place in this Torah reading and in Revelation as a model for accepting God. And that the Israelites, with all their handicaps, are struggling.
Yeah, I had one more question, and I think.
Please.
So, when you look at this, you can look at it as a narrative going forward. What I've always wondered about, I've been learning a lot during this. So, God was the one that created a famine in Israel that made the Jews, Israel, whatever they were called back then, go to Egypt in the first place. So he created this ark. In other words, they wouldn't be in Egypt had there not been a famine, right? And they ended up being there, and then he only frees them from the place that he made them go anyway. So that's probably part of the plan. But I'm just wondering, why couldn't they have learned these lessons? If there wasn't a famine, there would be no Exodus, no need. So like, why create the famine to have this 330-year detour only to go back again, right? So it's like they're back to where they once belonged anyway. But the whole process seems like you couldn't write a better story to like give it all this flavor and everything else. So it's just kind of like.
So I'm reluctant to place God in charge of every event. That is to say, Jewish thinking, rabbinic, midrashic thinking, takes God out of the direct action of the physical world very early on. Even the midrash, the late rabbinic period, so we're talking about 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, talk about God ceasing to do miracles at the end of the 6th day of creation. That God gets out of the miracle business, and that all of the miracles that come about are actually created at the end of the 6th day, in reserve. And so one of the key elements of Judaism versus other types of theology is we tend not to attribute every physical action to the will of the divine. Some stuff just happens. In fact, all stuff just happens. God is sort of out of the individual guidance of the world, because otherwise free will doesn't matter. And it's very important in a Jewish worldview and a Jewish theology for our actions to matter and for God not to be controlling the world around us.
No, I get that. I just think the irony of leaving because of famine, not there temporarily, there for 300 some odd years, and then God
it's a very well woven drama. And the connection between the Moses story and the Exodus from Egypt and the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is squarely in the story of Joseph. So we have the story of Joseph to get us to Egypt. And that story is perhaps the most beautifully crafted individual psychodrama in the entirety of the Torah. It may have been appended later on for exactly that reason. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yael, you have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to this discussion because I think it's such a crucial issue, whether God is involved in our everyday life or isn't involved. And when Joseph talks about to his brothers and he says, don't worry about throwing me in the pit and selling me as a slave, he said, because God did that in order for good to come out of it. So I think...
Well, certainly Joseph is giving them a pass because...
Don't see these links?
Because Joseph is saying, had you not done that, I would not have been here to save you from the famine. and which is nice on Joseph's behalf. I mean, he's willing to forgive. I mean, hindsight creates a good amount of forgiveness if we can see the good in it. But the question, and I'd like to maybe reframe it a little bigger on this question of the presence of God. God is present when we bring God into the picture by behaving well, by abiding by mitzvot, by commandments, by living in a way that is godly. We bring God into the world. And this is the Jewish idea. So what you're talking about, Yael, is absolutely true. Joseph behaves with forgiveness and mercy to his brothers and brings God into the moment by acting godly. And this is a central Jewish teaching, is our behavior is what makes us godly, and that we're partners in creation, that God isn't directing things because God is there for us to tap into at any given moment. And that when we connect with the divine, we are bringing creativity into the world as opposed to destruction into the world. And that God as a force for creation is complicated because some creation requires the destruction of other things, right? We have insects and fungi that break things down in order to make new things. But our job is to figure out how to turn a situation into a better situation than we found it. Call it the Jewish campsite principle, right? Leave the place better than we found it. And that's at the heart of Jewish society building, that we are trying to figure out, having been given the gift of existence, what does existence demand of us in order to make it better? And if we're only at a campground, at a campsite, it's very easy to leave it better than we found it. However, getting along with people, leaving relationships better than we found them, leaving nations better than we found them, that's a lot more complicated. And Judaism is our tool to a certain degree help us figure that out. With everyone's permission, a little bit, and we welcome Alana, thank you for coming, a little bit from Aviva, Professor Gottlieb Zornberg. She starts out with Jethro and the trauma of revelation, a paradigm. Jethro joins the Israelites, a new structure of identity. The experience of revelation is attended by conflicting emotions. For the people standing at Sinai at the highest point of their national history, fear vies with love, repulsion with attraction. In the biblical text, they recoil. They yield place to Moses. In the Midrashic narratives, the tension of desire and terror becomes central and overwhelming. The nature of this tension is the subject of our exploration. Why do the people recoil, resign their prophetic role to Moses, and how is one to relate to such a retreat? So she's starting off near the end of the story. For those of you who may remember, the second part of this parsha is the Israelites, and they are encountering God, and they say, Moses, it's too much. You go and talk to God. It's too frightening. The presence of God is too huge. We can't possibly approach God. We'll let you go to the top of the mountain without us. And, we have this, again, this constant push and pull with the Israelites, who are struggling in how to connect with the divine. And eventually, they basically they outsource it. They say, Moses, it's your job. We'll stay here. But again, that's the second part of this story. The first part, Professor Gottlieb Zornberg starts with, is in a characteristic juxtaposition of narratives from different registers of experience, the Torah prefaces the terror and glory of the giving of the Torah with the story of a family reunion. Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, Yitro, arrives in the Israelite camp, bringing Moses' wife and 2 sons. Chapter 18 tells in a matter-of-fact way of this family reunion, of a meal shared with Aaron and the elders, and of Jethro's suggestions for improving the Israelite legal administrative systems, Essentially, he proposes a judicial hierarchy, with Moses dealing only with the problems of greatest complexity. We didn't read all that, but we'll get back to it if we have time. But it's, of course, this very interesting story. Moses doesn't know anything about running a country. So we have Jethro come upon this scene where Moses is judging every single problem for the Israelites. By the way, it also hints, as we're going to talk about, as to whether or not this story happens in order. Because it sounds like Moses has already gotten the law when Jethro has arrived, but that hasn't happened yet in the Torah. One of the key principles of reading the Torah from our sages is that there is no before and after in Scripture, that things are not written in the order that they happened always, just to make things interesting. So here, although it is narrated before the Israelites' great encounter with God at Mount Sinai, this episode contains elements that lead the rabbinic sages to place it historically after Sinai. Obviously, I've read this before. There is, for instance, the reference to Moses' work as teaching the statutes of God and God's laws, which comes right after the opening bit that we read. These obviously could only have been administered after the law was given. Why then, if it happened after, is the Jethro episode narrated before Sinai? And this is our question, and one of the things that we've been dancing around, really looking at, is that maybe we're looking at the Jethro encounter as an ideal for somebody hearing about revelation, about something of meaning, and coming and paying appropriate homage to it and partnering in it. And that Jethro serves as this model as somebody who wasn't even born to it. One of the ongoing things that we see in Torah throughout is an elevation of the person who chooses to join the people of Israel, whether it's Jethro or an entire book dedicated to the person of Ruth, right? Ruth, who gets her own book. Why does Ruth get her own book? Ruth gets her own book because the message of the book of Ruth, the outcome of the book of Ruth, is who is Ruth? Ruth is the person who chooses Judaism and then becomes an ancestor to King David. So an outsider becomes Jewish and becomes an ancestor of King David. We have all sorts of anti-hierarchical messages in Judaism. We have a lot of dispute over primogeniture, over the first son gets everything. We argue with that all the way through the book of Genesis. And then we have this argument about purity. And while we have all sorts of genetic purity traditions in terms of the priesthood and the high priesthood, right? Levites and Kohanes, and who gets to still be a Kohen based on who the Kohen marries and all this sort of stuff. With regard to the monarchy and the ancestor of not just David, but also eventually in Jewish lore, the Messiah, we talk about a non-purity option. The choice matters more than biological heritage. In fact, placing Jew by choice, technically speaking, as a greater value than Jew by birth. Contrary, perhaps, to our contemporary culture. If I offer a corrective to where we are today as Jews, it is that we need to stop asking anybody to prove their Jewishness. We need to accept people who show up and want to participate in the Jewish project, however we define it, as Jewish enough, just like the rest of us, whomever we are. All right. Any questions or comments before we move on with my mini sermon about Jewish identity? The Midrashic reading opens up thematic analogies between the Jethro narrative and the giving of the Torah. It endows the very first word of the Parsha with profound resonance. So that first word is heard, right? It comes here in the English sentence structure, it comes late. But in the Hebrew, it is Vayishma Yitro. We read it, and it is the first word. And Jethro, priest of Midian, father-in-law of Moses, heard all that God had done to Moses and to Israel, his people, that God had taken Israel out of Egypt. What report did Jethro hear that made him come and accept Israel's religion? Rabbi Joshua said he heard of the war against Amalek. Rabbi Eliezer said he heard of the giving of the Torah and came. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said he heard of the splitting of the Red Sea and came. So here, the question is, what out there made Jethro come because he heard it? What was the thing, the event? So we have three rabbis coming up with three different ideas about what Jethro heard. This midrash makes a radical assumption. Jethro's coming is no longer a simple family affair, but rather it represents a spiritual crisis in his life, a recognition of the power of God and a desire to unite his fate, in some sense, with that of the Israelites. Read in this way, the first part of the chapter culminates in an actual ritual of proselytization. Jethro proclaims, "Now I know that God is greater than all the gods." And then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron and all the elders of Israel came to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law in the presence of God. These are the sacrifices of the proselyte, of the one who commits themselves to a full acceptance of the Torah. Indeed, they parallel the sacrifices that the Israelites bring in token of their commitment to the covenant later on in chapter 24 of Exodus. So we read this, and it's pretty dramatic. Jethro hears, he then listens, he then converts. And the Midrash is saying, and Professor Gottlieb Zornberg is saying, that he wouldn't have come had he not felt that he was sort of in this spiritual direction to begin with. He is leaving something behind. So she continues, in this Midrashic reading, the central question, therefore, is what did Jethro hear that made him commit himself to God and to God's Torah? The word Vayishma he heard becomes vital. What one hears has power to move one to heroic transformations. However, the questions that the rabbis ask and answer in three different ways is already plainly answered in the text. Because, of course, the text goes on to say, Jethro heard all that God had done to Moses and to Israel, his people, God's peoples, that God had taken Israel out of Egypt. The rabbi's discussion, therefore, seems redundant. Jethro heard the whole story of redemption and was inspired to join the people who experienced such wonders. So why did it's almost like the rabbis refuse to read the Torah for its own sake. Like they have to ask a question. The Torah gives us the answer, but the rabbis don't get it, except maybe they do. Because Professor Gottlieb Zornberg says, but the rabbis are, it seems, asking a more acute question. What was the specific narrative that had such power to move Jethro? Behind this compelling question lies a radical understanding of the power of narrative to address the privacies of individual experience. The story that has generative power is more than a chronicle of events. It is a way of rendering a moment, a drama that seems to resonate with the listener's inner idiom. Registering such a narrative, Jethro is drawn to hear more. So I'd like us all to think about somebody who has told us a story that has motivated us to seek them out, or seek the story out, of what it is to hear something. And again, remember, we are contrasting Jethro's experience with the Israelites seeing and living through miraculous. There is something more powerful going on for Jethro. He is inspired to move because of what he's heard. And for each one of us, I imagine at some point in our lives, we heard something from someone and maybe it was a song. Back in college, I heard an Eric Clapton song that I really loved. And back in the day, before we could download music, this motivated me. And there weren't even all that many listening places where I could listen to records. I went through a lot of Eric Clapton records trying to find this song that I'd heard on the radio. I didn't even know its title, but it clicked with me and I wanted to find it, right? I was highly motivated. There is something about that. There is something that grabs us and takes us out of ourselves and says, I need to hear more of that person or that thing. It's part of me now. And I think what's interesting is the Torah is almost acknowledging the power of story over the power of seeing. That maybe yet another thing that English idiom doesn't get quite right is seeing may not be believing as much as hearing. Hearing may be more believing. Also known as we get more powerful images from a story we read than a movie we see depicted of the story. That sometimes the rendition of the story into the visuals is not as powerful as our own imagination. For those of you old enough to have read Harry Potter before the movies, I am sure you understand that.
I had a question, but
Please.
before you get to that question, what was the Arab practice?
What was your question, sir?
Oh, well, I was going to ask you another question, but first I want to know what the song was.
I still never found it.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So the question had to do with your comment about like who's Jewish and being more welcoming. And so this is a bit off topic, but
It's okay.
the covenant was that male needs to be circumcised. And then it was you're Jewish if your mother was Jewish. So I never quite understood like how come, obviously nobody would get circumcised, but how come why was it the woman? And then I'm just curious what your belief is now in terms of welcoming and circumcision.
Well, the original definition of Judaism was patrilineal. Right? It's Abraham's children that are supposed to be Jewish, but then it's only some of Abraham's children. It's Jacob's children that are supposed to be, Isaac's children that are supposed to be Jewish, but only one of his children becomes Jewish. One of it, right? He has two sons, they're twins. We only count one as Jewish, both by the same parents. And then, right, we've got Jacob and Esau. Esau's not Jewish. Subsequently, Joseph has children by an Egyptian wife, but they're both Jewish. So the designation of inheritance of identity is, in the biblical world, is not matrilineal. In fact, priestly identity, which is the most rigidly retained, is all through the father's line. It doesn't matter if my mother is the daughter of a priest. It only matters if my father is the son of a priest, if I want to be a priest, a Kohen or a Levite. That changes. Roughly speaking, we have this change pegged, if we look at it from a sociological, anthropological, and textual perspective, at around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they come back to establish the Second Temple. And one of my colleagues wrote a paper saying that the reason they switched to matrilineal descent there was because they wanted to encourage Jewish men to marry Jewish women, to make sure that their children would inherit, because they were living among many people, and controlling and the identity of a household is most often determined by the woman. So a man marries somebody from another tribe, the likelihood is he's going to adapt that tribal identity, especially in a land where they're a minority. And so when the Israelites returned to Israel and became when the Jews returned to Israel from the Babylonian exile, they had to be cautious about household identity. And so they emphasized that in order for a man to have Jewish children, he had to marry a Jewish woman, because it was the woman's identity that determined their Jewish identity.
But the man would still need to be circumcised because of the covenant, or was that somehow?
The circumcision is not a matter of identity. It's an imposition on men from the time of Abraham, right? We have the story of Abraham circumcising, but circumcision is a whole nother story. In terms of contemporary identity, the Reform movement and the Reconstructionist movement are actually more rigorous about Jewish identity than Chabad. Why? Because if my mother were born to a Jewish mother, but were raised Catholic, and I was raised Catholic, I would count as Jewish in Chabad, but I wouldn't count as Jewish in a Reform synagogue. Because it turns out that in a Reform and a Reconstructionist synagogue, the metric is from a responsa that came out in the 1980s, that Jewish identity is determined by a Jewish person, is a person who is born with one Jewish parent and has public and timely declarations of their Jewish identity, meaning they have to go through Jewish ritual and Jewish upbringing. And then you can get the circumcision piece in, because then you can say, if I am not circumcised, and if I did not have a Jewish baby naming, and if I didn't have a bar mitzvah, and if I didn't have a confirmation, and if I didn't have Jewish identity, then it doesn't matter if my mother was a descendant of, the Vilna Gaon. Without all of those declarations of my Jewish identity, I'm not Jewish because I don't know anything about Judaism. I don't live a Jewish life. And so we have what we're seeing is today something of a clash of the practical membership of peoplehood on the one hand, and this designation of genetic heritage on the other. And since we are an opt-in people from the beginning, right? Since the designation of Jewish identity from the get-go has been, I choose to be Jewish. Joseph chooses to maintain his Jewish identity even as an Egyptian man. Ruth chooses to go with Naomi and stay Jewish and marry a Jewish person and so become Jewish. These are choices of affiliation. And these models are the model of Jewish participation. And it's where we get into trouble. We have a challenge, because then we start measuring our participation. We start saying, oh, you don't participate enough. Now, and I don't want to go there. Judaism forms communities of consent. A Jewish community is Jewish because it says so, and its participants agree. I get to be Jewish because I say so. No one is asking me for my certificate showing me that I had a Brit Milah. None of you have asked me to show my ordination certificate to prove that I'm a rabbi. And when someone behaves in a manner that we identify as Jewish, we say they're Jewish. When someone behaves in a manner that we identify as rabbinic or cantorial, we say, they're a rabbi, they're a cantor. It's when they don't behave in an appropriate manner that we have questions. I think, though, the measure of Jewish identity, Steve, has gotten to be a divisive one, and I don't think it's helpful.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to that is sometimes you hear these stories where people go through a conversion, but they felt they were always Jewish. Something inside them told them that they're Jewish, and oftentimes they'll find out that in their heritage there was Jewishness, but it was never practiced, but they felt it inside. And
so I'm married to somebody who is more Jewish internally than I am, but wasn't raised Jewish. So Ginny converted to Judaism before we got married, and she has a more Jewish internal compass than almost anybody I've ever met. And what do you mean that's your situation, Alana? You want to explain?
So my family's ethnic background is Jewish. For various reasons. My grandmother was raised as a Catholic and raised my mother as a Catholic. My cousin, who's close in age to me, is in an Orthodox family. She married into an Orthodox family and converted. And they're raising 3 children in the Orthodox faith, which is wonderful. And I am currently going through the conversion process with a local temple.
Wonderful.
It's been put on hold a bit because of the current situation. But I found out that our family on my mother's side actually was Jewish about 7 years ago. And I didn't know before because my mother and her mother, so my mother and my maternal grandmother, who is still alive, she just turned 94 yesterday,
God bless.
had been estranged for decades. And I was actually raised in Germany. And so I didn't have a close relationship with her until we moved back to the States when I was in my teens. So these are all things that I found out within the last decade.
So this brings me, I'm going to stop the text because I think we've got plenty to talk about without the text. So many people come to Judaism feeling, as Alana might have, as her family might have, an affinity, as Steve, as you talked about, because of some heritage that we don't know about. And that there's a wonderful book called The Mezuzah and the Madonna's Foot about crypto Jews in Southwestern America who have come to the United States and discovered that they are descendants of conversos who secretly lit Shabbat candles and did all sorts of rituals and maintained these minimal Jewish identity pieces through centuries of hiding. I think it's bigger than that. I think in addition to all of these genetic typologies, I think honestly, Judaism cultivates a certain way of thinking. And it's not particular to all Jews, but I think many people are attracted to Judaism because we have a tendency towards a nimbleness of thought, an acceptance of difference, a recognition that each of us brings something unique to the conversation. And let's go back to that theology piece that I was talking about. Phil says, I always felt Jewish. I grew up Southern Baptist, but as I got older, I felt Jewish. When I took the conversion classes, everything felt familiar. Rabbi Judy said, we converts were born with a Jewish soul. Absolutely.
And the other thing that was very interesting is the young man that my cousin married. She's a few years younger than I am. His family went through a very similar thing. His grandparents are Catholic. His father found out that they were a Jewish family, returned to Orthodoxy, and raised him and his siblings in Orthodoxy.
Wow.
So the story sort of paralleled our families as well.
And think about this, though, that in most other forms of identity, there's no way of joining, really. There's no way to become Chinese. There's no, I could theoretically marry a Chinese person and we could have children. And then maybe in 2 or 3 generations, our descendants would be identified as, really Chinese. However, each and every one of us, those who've chosen to become Jewish, whether we did so as adults or whether we continue to do so as children because our parents were Jewish, however it is that we identify Jewishly, all of us can choose to become Israelis. We can join a nation by choice. We have a unique, I could become Catholic, but I can't become an Italian Catholic. I could become Catholic with an Italian priest, but that's not going to get me Italian citizenship.
Could you be Pope?
Could I be Pope? God forbid. Yeah, Al.
I was very interested and moved by what you said about the conversion process in the Reform or conservative movement versus Orthodox. And I had that experience explained to me. I was studying with a Chabad rabbi on a regular basis in the old days when we used to study in person. And he said that he had a very interesting experience that day, that an elderly Catholic priest came in and said, Rabbi, I just found out that my mother's Jewish. What do I do? He said, nothing. Welcome home. So it was very, very illustrative of exactly what you said.
And really, so I'll leave us with one more image of God to think about. And Alana talks about, so much about this obscured stuff that comes forward. And one of the terms for God in Hebrew is hamakom, the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe very strongly that this idea that God is present everywhere, but we know God is present when we do something to make God present, when we turn a place into the place, whether that place is a place of welcome. And look, we managed this evening to turn a Zoom meeting, which is no place, into a powerful place, right? Here we are connected. I don't have any, I know some of you from past experiences and know where you're located, but we are, across the country as far as I can tell. And suddenly there is God in this place and we didn't know it, right? Which is what Jacob said when he put his head down and dreamt on the rock. And there is God in my family and I didn't yet know it. These things that we discover as we go through our lives and we figure out deeper meaning, Judaism needs to be, for all of us, the accompaniment, the vessel for that meaning as we go through things. And I thank you all for joining us for this little journey. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. And Alana, no problem. Come as late as you like. You're always welcome. Thank you all so much. I look forward to seeing you.
Thanks, Rabbi. See you tomorrow.
Jonathan.
Take care, everybody. Have a good evening.
Have a good one.
Thank you.